What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and if you've listened along so far, you know I'm someone who tends to obsess over the why and dig deeper into the context of things, often to a fault, and often into the world of hypotheticals I tormented my first grade teacher with. But that's the best part of the off season to me. Some people look at this time of year as a throwaway, and I think we can all agree that we're suffering from some post-draft burnout. This was around the time that I hosted my first solo 3-hour radio show back in 2021. And I found it somewhat freeing to be able to just talk about sports and things that matter in this industry without a specific focus, be it on training camp, post-game analysis, or breaking down opponents. And I know a lot of you listening are local to New Orleans, and I plan to cover the Saints. Just with everything that's going on, I honestly haven't had time to watch the film on their new prospects yet. Without that knowledge, what I will say is that the Saints are one of the more impressive teams to me in finding strong prospects outside of the first round. Not to say that they fail in the first round, but a lot of teams can't draft for depth, and I think the Saints are very skilled at doing so. The draft itself is a weird phenomenon. Analysts spend their entire season studying these prospects and trying their best to evaluate them with ultimately limited knowledge. We have to remember that there's just this iceberg of information on every player that NFL teams have, and we only are really able to scratch the surface of that information. Sure, there are things that come out like medical flags and character flags, but those are always specific to a situation, and you just have to remember that not always just flags, but there's always that information about players that we're just never going to get access to. Speaking of the Saints, I recall the reaction to them drafting Alontae Taylor last year in the second round, and they had no picks till round 5 thereafter. It was a impassioned reaction, to put it kindly. People hadn't really heard of him or just saw his fit with New Orleans. I just remember looking up Taylor on draft night and feeling like I was looking at a completely different player. So I interviewed his trainer twice, actually, who has worked with him since 7th grade, Lorenzo Zoe Spikes, who's a former Gators wide receiver. He didn't just help him train to go to college and then the pros. He helped him through several position switches. He started as starting quarterback in high school and was recruited by Tennessee as a wide receiver. But then he became the first defensive back to start for the Volunteers for the season since 2013. And then his first game as a Saint was in-game action in week 2 when Marshawn Lattimore got ejected mid-game against the Buccaneers. It's quite an unceremonious entry into the league, to say the least. And then Tom Brady targeted him twice, and he broke up both passes, and Brady didn't try him again. And it's probably the best compliment you can get as a cornerback in the NFL in your first time on the field. And then his real first NFL assignment was back in against the Cardinals after he spent some time on injured reserve when the team was down both starting cornerbacks. So his first coverage assignment was guarding DeAndre Hopkins. And out of 5 targets in coverage, Taylor allowed just 1 catch. And then he followed that up with completely shutting down Davante Adams with really impressive press coverage skills. But what showed most was how frustrated Adams was getting because he could not get off the line of scrimmage. You could tell that Taylor had really taken his time in his film study to analyze the tendencies of Adams and how he cuts off the line of scrimmage, and he just had him stuffed and he couldn't get anywhere. To me, Alontae Taylor is just a classic case of the fear of the unknown. But I think he's also a reminder for us to dig deeper and perhaps look at what a player can do rather than hyper-focus on team-based need or position fits. A player selected at number 49th overall isn't done so without a vision. But what Taylor's most impressive trait was to me was his vision. And it was hard for me to ignore his experience at quarterback and how that showed in spatial awareness, his peripheral vision, and his ability to just scan the entire field, dropping back into coverage seamlessly. And all of those traits, thinking back on it, got me thinking more about the assessment that I talked about on my last show. Also, I'm sorry, I'm not Italian, but I speak like I am one. So just throwing that out there as I make a pizza with my hands. As I said, the off season, it's a good time to put your creative thinking cap on. Think about the possibilities or those good old hypotheticals. Sometimes those thoughts go nowhere. They often do. And sometimes there's no meaningful conclusion. In other words, There's nothing significant to be drawn from it. In psychology, we use statistical significance as a basis of drawing our conclusions through something called a p-value. That's a calculation that I frankly don't remember, so I won't even try to go there. I've actually tried applying it to football through software, though, when I was analyzing the relative athletic RAS scores, I think last offseason, and I quickly realized there's really just no ability to apply statistics to the limited information we have on most NFL-related topics. But I'm not a scientist, and I'm not drawing any conclusions today, or really ever on this show. I've mentioned that this is really a space to help us all learn, myself included, and sometimes revisiting how we look at, I guess, universal truths in this industry can help us do that. So for this third episode, I'm delving into the hypothetical of how the inherent flaws in the NFL draft process and subsequent player development could be improved in several ways. If you caught my last episode, I interviewed the director of clinical and sports psychology at University of Arizona, Mike Clark. And we discussed an assessment that he administers called the AIQ, the Athletic Intelligence Quotient. It's an assessment meant to look at the cognitive abilities of college and NFL players and how those directly relate to football skills. There's several areas they focus on, with the main buckets being visual processing, learning efficiency, reaction time, and processing speed. Those 4 areas provide insight into a player's spatial awareness, his ability to navigate the field, how he learns and processes new information, how he retains that information, and his reaction time to different types of stimuli. I remembered that I had started trying to take the Wonderlic test before interviewing Mike, which is the IQ test that was historically used in the NFL draft, and I stopped midway because I can't do mental math. I went back to it for due diligence after seeing that you could use a pen and paper, and in the end, after a whole lot of absolute guesses, which aren't penalized, I scored a 26. I believe it's out of 50. On the Wonderlic test prep website, for what usage I truly could not tell you, that score puts me between the average score for 2 professional categories: salesperson at 25, and a very odd amalgamation of professions in librarian, copywriter, and investment analyst at 27. Yet, if I was an NFL quarterback, and with the caveat that none of the leaked Wonderlic scores have ever been verified, I'm in the company of Jay Cutler and Carson Palmer at 26, 1 score below Jameis Winston and Joe Flacco, and 2 below Russell Wilson, Peyton Manning, and Drew Brees, who all allegedly scored a 28 on the Wonderlic. So what this aptitude test or intelligence test is telling me is that if I'm in the real world, I'm looking at a job in retail or as a librarian, and not to diminish those professions, but I could easily be an NFL starting quarterback at the same time. One of the things that had implored the co-creator of the test, Scott Goldman, to make this assessment was the Wonderlic scores that were leaked of Peyton Manning and Ryan Leaf, who scored a 27 and Manning's 28. And as we all know, the difference in their play could not have been more staggering. Then you consider the fact, and I won't get too into the weeds here, but the Supreme Court ruled that the Wonderlic's usage as a basis for promotion in a power company plant violated the Civil Rights Act on the grounds of racial-based discrimination in employment. The court found that the assessment was not directed nor intended to measure the ability to learn to perform a particular job or a category of jobs. And despite, again, the test prep website just giving me 2 career paths, it was purported as a neutral test, and there was no proof of malicious intent in its usage, but the results had a disparate impact on African-American employees. But this ruling only applied to instances where it's, a primary factor or there's a cutoff and it's a determinative thing in their promotion or employment, whereas that's not the case in the NFL, or at least one will never have the real answer to. There's no known cutoff, and it's just used as one of various sources of information that they have on players. But if you ask me, the Wonderlic scores are really just a way for teams to employ confirmation bias, something we're all guilty of at times, where we seek out information that confirms or supports beliefs we already hold and don't really intend to change with new insight. And you're really only looking for that directly supports your argument and throwing out that of which is incongruent. It's shown no correlation to on-field performance. And quite honestly, taking just a sample of that test brought up these panicky feelings for me, as it took me back to my time taking the SAT and later the GRE and the mental math that still gives me night sweats to this day. And that was the majority of that test, besides pairing together, saying if a words were similar, unrelated, or contradictory, or unscrambling them. Mainly, I was asked to add fractions, find the proportion of someone's investment to their relative payout, the average parking cost over 3 separate weeks. That required a ton of calculations. I don't even really remember how to divide with decimals at this point, and it just made my head spin. How in the world does that translate to a single relevant skill, both in my career path and that of a professional athlete? Because I never saw the point of the SAT growing up. And then when I took the GRE at the time to become a clinical psychologist, it only made my feelings grow stronger on this topic. So if you're unfamiliar with the AIQ, I highly recommend my last episode, as I think it was very easy to understand on a scientific level, and we really highlighted the different areas that this test assesses and how to apply that knowledge to football-based skills, like assessing the shortest path from point A to point B, or the presentation of different types of stimuli you have to react to on the field, things that display traits like navigation or processing speed, football skills, have the ability to do algebra or figure out who of 6 siblings is first in line or the tallest. You all know these types of questions that I'm talking about. I keep thinking, and it's really made me think on how we view intelligence in general, but really how we look at it in athletes and actually utilize that information for player development and improvement, rather than some sort of elimination process in the draft. I don't think the Wonderlic really holds that much weight anymore, or that it's really shown much in looking at the alleged scores we do have. My cohort of Jay Cutler and Carson Palmer were taken 11th and 1st overall, respectively. Jameis Winston, 1 score higher, also taken 1st overall. But Russell Wilson and Drew Brees were taken in the 3rd and the 2nd round, who both scored higher than everyone I just mentioned. So perhaps this discussion is insignificant or all for naught, as we've moved on to different tests in the NFL, but I know that it's still being administered, at least I believe so. And I'm really less interested with the issues of the Wonderlic and more curious about what the draft would be like if every single player took the AIQ or a similar cognitive assessment. Like I said, all this stuff has come out about the S2 cognition test, and I frankly just don't know enough about the background of that test like I do the AIQ. Either way, I think something like this would illuminate a lot about guys perceived as project or developmental picks who fall to later rounds more than it would separate the cream from the crop. In my time at the Scouting Academy, the focus has been on what the player can do first, and then you write the cannot section thereafter. The first group I completed was defensive back, which includes cornerbacks, nickelbacks, strong, and free safety. Out of all the defensive back positions, safeties are usually touted as the smartest, and those who can kind of have a little less athletic ability compared to cornerbacks. But now I keep thinking about the cannot sections I wrote on these players, and specifically how a lot of them fared in man versus zone coverage. On an elementary level, zone coverage requires players to know their zone, when a player is in their zone, and when to stick with him or hand him off once he leaves said zone, often bringing in what's called pattern match coverage. Rather than defend a specific zone-based area, that set of rules, when you're pattern matching, is really based on the distribution of the eligible receivers on offense. So in other words, the defensive backs engage and the linebackers, whoever is covering underneath, based on what the receiver's actions are. So the scale of the term mental processing, which is one of the primary traits that we look at to scout each position. So each position has specific traits. To quarterback, that wouldn't apply to defensive line, like range versus use of hands and linemen. But mental processing is one of those umbrella traits and the 5 traits that you look at with every single position group. And that scale of mental processing to me just seems to grow with those rules of coverage in zone and then pattern match principles versus just a solid athletic press man cover corner. Those guys can often just be that athletic and be able to spot, the initial tendencies of footwork by the receivers they're assigned to via film study. But now I wonder, is it always mental processing from a football IQ or a general IQ standpoint? Or is there something going on there with perhaps their visual or spatial processing instead? I mentioned my concussion in my introductory episode, and seems like a good time to go into my corresponding visual disorder and subsequent eye therapy. So concussion symptoms can really depend on what part of the brain you hit. Our occipital lobe is what controls our sight and vision. So an injury here can lead to blind spots, blurred vision, issues with visual recognition, and spatial analysis. I had fainted in a bagel shop after sitting on a wooden bench behind the coffee counter, and as recanted to me by the lady standing behind me in line, I pinballed off those various services on the way down, which explained why I woke up with pain points in two different parts of my head and on my chin, which is when I hit the floor. I got to the ER, there's nothing to signify a brain bleed or anything dangerous. And I remember how understanding the VA was, which is where I had just started working at the time. And the weeks I spent literally stapling and printing papers for weeks because I hadn't accumulated enough time off and I could not do anything that required the use of my brain. I thought I was on the other side of things. And then I started seeing blurry spots every so often. I remember watching a presentation at the VA and feeling like I was watching a woman in front of a projector screen in 2D when it should be in 3D. So at that point, I called my doctor. They told me to go back to the ER. I'm not having a stroke. Finally, they sent me to a neurologist. And after an hour of mildly excruciating visual tests, diagnosed me with a disorder called convergence insufficiency. What that means is the nerves in your eye muscles aren't working right. When you focus on something up close, your eyes turn with it as it moves with you. Like, when we did cross-eye as children, which is something I'm actually incapable of doing now. I'll show you now, and this might give me a headache, and I hope that it works on here, but I'm going to bring a pencil towards my nose slowly and just watch how you'd think my eyes are supposed to move together, but when it reaches a certain depth, one eye starts to spaz out a little bit, and I believe it's my left, which will probably be on the right-hand side for you, and rather than turn inward, it starts to kind of spaz out and turn outward. Whew. Gonna pay for that one. Hopefully that just showed something going on with my eye. If not, I have a migraine for nothing. So that led to me attending 8 weeks of eye therapy where I would put on these, goggles and get a PlayStation controller. The test I best remember is there was a woman on the screen and she had 4 letter M as in Michael's. I guess it doesn't really matter the letter, and I don't really know why the lady ordered letters, but they were all positioned at north, south, east, and west. So each round, one of those M's would move forward into focus, and I'd have to click the corresponding place on the controller of which M had moved forward. My reaction time was measured accordingly. And I also had issues with my balance as a result. And so the second half of my sessions, I would stand on one of those half medicine ball type things where there's a flat surface that you balance on, and I'd be with my face right up to the screen. And, that was a variety of different tasks. So, there would be a lot of things going around in circular motions, red, white, and blue circles, letters A through Z, numbers 1 through 20. And my tasks would be something like, go through the letters of the alphabet while getting the red circles in between that. So I'd have to locate the A and then locate a red circle, then locate the B, and so on and so forth. Then do that with the numbers, white circles, and that all mixed together. Not as easy as it sounds. That eventually helped enough. And I still have to wear what are called prism glasses as a result that bend light to help pull my bad eye in the right direction. I don't wear them on camera because they give a very unfortunate glare. But, if I'm reading something on my phone and I go without them for a day, I get migraines, blurred vision, and I just feel so mentally exhausted. I explain all this to go back to my point about mental processing and whether we're always really looking at the right thing there. Maybe that free safety doesn't have issues with anything besides navigation. So when they're coming down from roaming deep and trying to find the best downward angle in space to tackle the ball carrier running free, The best line isn't usually a straight line in football. But as Mike Clark had gone over in our interview, if a player has issues with navigation, they just might not know what the best path is. So that probably leads to them being out of position to make that tackle, the whiff tackles, if you will. Or on the converse, they have good navigation, but bad spatial awareness. So they can take the right path, but they can't account for the bodies and space and everything that's in the way of them getting there, or what's happening in their peripheral, or the feet of a nearby player that they end up tripping on due to not seeing them crossing in front of their path. Are they bad mental processors? Or could they benefit from some training specific skills similar to what I described in eye therapy? All the skills that are assessed in the AIQ are trainable and can be improved on. Can't say the same about the Wonderlic. Believe me, I have been trying improving my arithmetic abilities quite literally my entire life. It just feels like there's something missing, that there's a gap in the information that teams have about players and really what players have about themselves. When I was finally diagnosed with convergence insufficiency, it was nothing short of full-blown relief that I finally could put a name to these bizarre, troubling symptoms that I was experiencing. In that same note, a frustrated player might completely change their outlook and attitude on their struggles if they were provided tangible areas to improve in the way that actually helps them as a unique human being improve their skill set. We might see round 2 or 3 guys go from strong developmental guys with upside to starting caliber players. But where I think we'd really see the value is in those later rounds for the guys that are fighting for a roster spot, the diamonds in the rough who respond well to coaching. So, not cognitive assessment is going to solve communication or humility issues. There's other help for that. But I think this assessment could just bridge the gap of understanding between what a player can truly do and can't do. I think players could immensely benefit from some type of standardized cognitive assessment system, rather than be relegated to special teams until something clicks, or often never does, and leads to a player's release because we're not looking at the right thing. They could be training a tangible skill that translates to an improvement in their on-field performance. And then maybe they have a shot. It would be empowering, I think, for players to have the ability to know this information about themselves and decide whether or not they want to improve it. That could be also something that holds great value. Players opting into testing and subsequent improvement should they choose. That really could change someone's story. Instead of being drafted as a flyer in round 6 or 7, maybe they sneak into round 5. Or an undrafted rookie can present their case to a team post-draft and be given that opportunity to improve that skill set and display that interest to teams that they feel they have the best chance to land on the 53-man roster. And that leads me to my final point of discussion in my post-draft rabbit hole of thoughts that we have going on here. Like I said, this year's draft just took on a completely different meaning for me, being Tulane sideline reporter. I had vested interest in every draft pick through 7 rounds, and it was stressful and exhausting and consumed literally my entire weekend. In the end, I couldn't have been more thrilled with how it played out. Tajay Spears and Dorian Williams rightly went in round 3 to teams that I really see a vision for them, but 8 smart teams took a chance on Green Wave players in the post-draft rookie free agency signing process. The more I look at several of those landing spots, the more I see the value in that process and players' chance at success. The first night of the draft is an offensively long round 1. That's it. And now we've added a lot of screaming fans and influencers for absolutely no reason. Not to get on that rant, day 2 is rounds 2 and 3. After that, we just bulldoze through rounds 4 through 7 and everything's done on Saturday afternoon. And each round has a shorter clock as the draft goes on. By day 3, it's hard not to think, I'm just tired watching this draft, but the mental fatigue has to set in for team decision makers in the draft room. And it's a day that I think has 2 very significant rounds, followed by 2 often useless final ones, all done in immediate succession with really no time to breathe, reflect, reassess roster needs after drafting those first few rounds, and perhaps have a final conversation with some players they might consider taking a chance on in round 6 or 7 while they're not in the middle of the literal draft. I keep thinking about local success story Tulane linebacker Nick Anderson, who was signed by the Saints as an undrafted free agent, the team of his dreams. But he was on the phone with Seattle in the middle of round 7 with head coach Pete Carroll, who might have taken him with their final pick. I think instead they went with the running back. Nick told WWL's Brooke Kirchhoffer that the Saints had told him they wanted to draft him and they would if they had the opportunity, but they had traded away their 2 7th-round picks to move up in an earlier round that day. That's how quickly someone's life can change in that final day of the draft where those trades were made. And those picks are, frankly, I think, used as trade pieces more often than deliberate player selection almost all the time. And when Nick Anderson was presented with the choice, he picked the Saints when they came calling mid-conversation with Pete Carroll. And if you ask me, looking at the two situations on their face, Nick's shot is miles greater with the Saints. For one, they know him. He's been in their backyard this entire time. They've had the chance to see him when Tulane practices at the practice facility. It's a lot easier to go to Tulane games than it is any other team in terms of vicinity. But the Seahawks also signed 3 linebackers in that free agency draft class, and Nick was one of 2 in the Saints. And I'll never forget him pulling out a Sam Mills jersey when he came to sit down with us for an interview on Tulane's Pro Day. It kind of reminded me of, when we were told to make our first choice in college really known to that school, because that's something that they value, is that commitment. It's hard to think that totally went over the Saints' heads. I think that fighting spirit in Sam Mills is just present in Nick Anderson in spades. And I think, again, that he's in the best place for that opportunity for him to have a shot in the NFL. And sure, he could have made more money if he was drafted in the 7th round. But what matters more, I guess, that or the true ability to succeed? The Saints have a history, I think, of deliberately signing rookies after the draft wraps up. Pathways to succeed. I remember way more undrafted free agents than I do of surprise 6th and 7th round picks. And maybe part of that is just the feel-good aspect of that story of a player that came from not being drafted to being a player that makes a difference. But this draft just really put in perspective for me, A, how random, but B, just how somewhat meaningless the process can get. These are players that have made careful, deliberate choices their entire lives leading up to this moment. And then it's just out of their hands entirely. A player could meet with the team 20 times, but he has no agency there. He's not interviewing them, at least not in a way that awards the player any decision-making there. I'd be curious if you surveyed the guys drafted in round 6 and 7 over the years and asked if they were happy just to be drafted or wish that they maybe had signed with a team they felt was a better fit, I think we might be a little surprised by the result. Even if it served as nothing more for a streamlined motivator for these kind of fringe players to feel they landed in the right place with the best opportunity, best coaching staff for their one shot. So what if the draft stopped after 5 rounds? And after that, rather than spend Saturday just absolutely flying through 128 player selections, that day was spent doing that kind of recon, that reassessment, and having those final conversations with free agent players who would just sign as a greater class with an extra day of reflection by both parties. I'm all about players making as much money as they can in a sport that is not guaranteed for a snap. But I also think about all the guys who's just wasted away in the NFL that might have been some of those diamonds in the rough. But by the time they bounce around 4 practice squad rosters, they've just completely lost their ability to direct their motivation to any sort of specific goal and find that they're on the right coaching staff, because that staff on a 4th team on the practice squad, let's just be honest, they likely have little to no investment in their development whatsoever, because they were panic drafted by another team that found themselves on the clock with no clear direction and just threw a dart at the dartboard. Not saying that's the case all the time, but it just does start to accumulate and feel a bit pointless. There are teams that draft historically well. There are those that are notably awful at times. Some, like I said about the Saints, are much more apt at later rounds than others. But as a whole, to me, the process is just still flawed. And when you add in these weird, varied assessments that are not publicized, discussed, or standardized amongst players, it just muddies the water more. In a perfect world, these developmental players have perhaps more choice in their destiny. And perhaps they have corresponding cognitive scores they can present to a team with an improvement plan they've identified for themselves. That alone is a display of initiative, leadership, and personal accountability that I think would endear teams to players that they otherwise might find invisible. And scouts who report back on weaknesses in scouting reports and strengths would continue to do the job they're best at doing. But a team whose staff values the AIQ might compare all of that to the players in their database, historical database models, and see perhaps a path for players they otherwise might not have awarded that chance to. These things are likely to never take place at this scale in the NFL, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about ways that these processes can improve. Because at one point in history, there was no Wonderlic, and then there was only the Wonderlic. Now we add on the AIQ and the S2 and those RAS scores that measure and weigh their combine performance relative to other players at their position. And we can see that there are building blocks already taking place here. But there's just no universal philosophy applied to the draft process as a whole. And there are some teams that have employed sports psychologists and those that specifically administer the AIQ, like the co-creator Scott Goldman, who's worked for the Lions and the Dolphins in the past. I just think that the draft is a paramount example of being settled and set in old ways. It's hard to think that it changes that drastically at any point. But that's why we have these conversations. That's why I offer personal examples of things I've gone through. I know they're not perfectly apt comparisons, but again, there's only so much that I can directly apply to a sport I've never played. But I also don't know that many people who have gone to eye therapy for visual disorders, and it changed my perspective on how we perceive struggles in general in other human beings. My symptoms were due to a concussion, but those same spatial processing and other visual issues can present in players as shown in the AIQ. And it would be a shame to think that these deficits shut them out from a sport that has evolved on the field as a chess match since its inception. I think it's time to evolve the way we think about a lot of things in football, but intelligence might be the most important trait. So that's all for this Tuesday tangent brought to you by Before the Whistle. I hope this format resonates with those listening. As I said, there's plenty of time to get to team-specific analysis on both the NFL and the college level. But for someone who has an interest in coaching someday, I try to approach each day as a learning opportunity for myself and how I would try to offer my own unique value to this industry. Because I think there's something to be said about outsider perspectives that can offer something new outside of strategy and scheming. And if I ever get decision-making power in that role, the AIQ and its universal employment on that team would be first on my list. I promise I will get through this without laughing one day, but this is new for me, self-promotion. But again, if you like my bi-weekly rants, please remember to like and subscribe to this podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts and YouTube, and I'll be dropping these new episodes every Tuesday and Friday moving forward. I hope this episode helped us all learn something new and just perhaps think a little more about what really goes on before the first snap, because that's all I want us to be able to do here is just be a little curious and explore that. And with that, I promise not to play Rebecca Black, but I will see you all on Friday.